two networks, two nations, one major event.
Let me ask you your question. We are not speaking for America.
Globalization has changed everything.
The Cold War is over.
We need each other.
But you're losing friends.
No, I don't think so.
Everyone should just step back a little bit at this point.
For the first time on television and with a live studio audience, CCTV News and SKYNEWS Australia have brought together important voices from both nations to debate the future of their relationship.
With the current shift of wealth and influence from the west to the east well underway, Asia's regional dynamics are changing so fast. China will arguably become an economic superpower in the foreseeable future. And actually, we have become the biggest trading partner with all Asia's economies. Australia, one of the US closest allies, is obviously a crucial player in the region. But do the two countries share exactly the same vision about the future of Asia? How does Australia position itself in maintaining the regional order, particularly how it would pick sides with China or the United States? With the recent economic downward pressure in China, will the bilateral economic ties between the two countries be undermined as a result? I'm Yang Rui. Representing China here are four experts. Let's look at who they are.
Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from the Ministry of National Defense is the director of the Center for International Security Cooperation. Starting his military service in 1979, Colonel Zhou committed to multilateral cooperation in the Air Force and later became the Chinese Defense Attaché to the Republic of Namibia. He was also a visiting fellow at the Land Warfare Study Center of the Australian Army in 1999. Professor Zhu Feng is Executive Director at Nanjing University's China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea. As a scholar specializing in the study of historical facts and political implications of the South China Sea, Professor Zhu writes extensively on regional security and acts as an independent consultant for the Chinese government. Zhu Ning is the Deputy Dean and Professor of Finance at Shanghai's Advanced Institute of Finance. He is also a faculty fellow at the Yale University International Center for Finance. Professor Zhu's consulting experience covers the People's Bank of China, Shanghai's municipal government, as well as investment banks. Charles Liu is the founder of How Capital, which has managed over $1 billion in assets. Since 1999, he has been a senior advisor to GE Capital, IBM, and many other major international corporations on strategies within China.
A warm welcome to the home team, please.
Very sound and wise words of introduction from you,
Welcome,
Ray. Thank
Jim.
you very much for inviting us here to Beijing for this groundbreaking debate. It's become a commonplace in Australia in recent times to say that Australia has no more significant economic relationship than with China. But it is undoubtedly true that Australia's future prosperity is inextricably bound to the health of the Chinese economy. And that's just one reason why so many Australians are so interested in everything that is developing here. But then there is also the great chess game that is going on to Australia's north, a strategic contest that troubles many, many Australians, myself included. I'm Jim Middleton, and to join the Australian side of this debate, we have Greg Smith, Gary Smith, Greg McCarthy, Rowan Callett, and John Russell.
Gary Smith is the Vice President and Professor of International Relations at Deakin University. He's widely published in the area of Australia's engagement with Asia and international relations in the Asia-Pacific. For several years, he was an academic program director at a senior executive college of the Defense Department. Greg McCarthy is the BHP Middleton Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University. He provides academic leadership for over 40 Australian studies centers at universities and institutes across China. His research focuses on transitional change within and between nations, exploring how material, cultural, and political forces create instability. Rowan Kallick is the Australian newspaper's China correspondent. As a double Walkley Award winner, Kallick has worked and lived in Papua New Guinea and Hong Kong. He has been a member of the Australia-Indonesia Institute Board and of the Foreign Minister's Foreign Affairs Council. John Russell is the managing director of Beijing North Head consulting firm. Before coming to China in the 1990s, he worked as the managing director of the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU in Brussels during the opening up of Eastern Europe and the rollout of the European single market.
A big applause to the guest team, our Australian panel, please. For the past years, China has been able to enjoy a comfortable relationship with Australia. But this relationship is not without challenges. The following video will be about the challenges and adversity of the new circumstances ahead. How can political trust, for example, be further enhanced? The video itself will illustrate more details. Let's watch.
As Australia further integrates with Asia and China reaches out globally, what are their expectations of one another? And what is their potential for further cooperation, economically, politically, and militarily?
我们完全可以超越生意上的伙伴关系，做倡导共同理念的战略伙伴。
China's rapid military buildup is drawing world attention. As another regional powerhouse, how does Australia view China's increasing strength? How can the two countries work together to keep the Asia-Pacific safe and secure?
The big geopolitical story that we are experiencing at the moment is the rise of Asia, in particular, the rise of China.
While the U.S. is escalating its military involvement in the Asia-Pacific, how should an Asia-oriented Australia position itself between China and America? What is the country's security outlook in Asia?
There are no better friends than the United States and Australia.
Australia has a strong economic partnership with China and a solid military alliance with the U.S. How can it maintain balance? And does it need to choose between the two?
Welcome back. Now, Jim, I wonder if Australia, as the closest ally here in this region, would find it very difficult to pick sides over the issue of South China Sea. This issue flared up in recent years, and many economists in this region who depend on China's trade and investment would find it increasingly difficult to position yourself properly. I'd like to have a take from Rowan. You've been long enough deployed here to observe the latest development and the new realities. Is China a threat? And how would you pick your sides if you have to?
My personal view is that China is not a threat to Australia, but events in the South China Sea have started to prove destabilizing in the region, upsetting the harmony which has kept the region growing and indeed made it the world's economic powerhouse led by China. I think the concern is that some of China's neighbours, Vietnam, Philippines in particular, have expressed unease about China's building bases inside the South China Sea, and Australia's position is we'd like to see a defusing of this tension, and if there are disagreements between China and the neighbours, then they can be sorted out ideally on a multilateral basis where they can be argued calmly.
Let me ask you your question. but again on the South China Sea. As far as the Australian military is concerned, to my knowledge, the Australian military has been operating in a so-called gate operation for quite some time in the South China Sea with aircraft patrolling and ship patrolling. So my question is freedom of navigation. That is the key word. If you are there because of freedom of navigation, could you give me an example that how freedom of navigation is impeded because of China's behavior? And being an ally of the United States and taking no position in the South China Sea, do you believe that your presence in the South China Sea, which is so far away from your periphery, is not actually affecting the situation in the South China Sea?
Well, my view is Australia's contribution would be very small, and it's there to support politically the United States position. So it's not a military contribution, it's a political contribution to the United States position. It's one that is not much discussed in Australia and not much debated in Australia and should be, but we're there essentially as a political gesture to the United States.
I think if I can just add, we are there also because it's in our own interest to be there, because probably Australia is more exposed to trade in Asia than any Asian country. And so most of our trade goes through the South China Sea. So it's very important for us to make sure that there's no destabilization of our trade.
Neither of you have answered the Colonel's question. What incident has there been of freedom of navigation being impeded that is the cause of your grand political gesture in support of the United States? Has there been any? And all the militarization has been Australian warships, Japanese warships, US warships, and planes flying into the South China Sea. Did you complain over the building of islands by Vietnam, by the Philippines, and by others in these islands over decades? All of a sudden, you decide, oh, the Americans want us to jump, so we jump.
Isn't the question, though, and this goes to any member of the panel from China, that the dynamism of Chinese military behaviour in the South China Sea, and indeed in the East China Sea as well over recent years, raises the prospect of unintended consequences, raises the prospect of conflict, not necessarily by design but by accident, and in a set of sea lanes which are so important not just to Australia, not just to Southeast Asia, not just to China, but to so much of the global economy, that this is a matter for urgent resolution, not for militarization.
Okay, personally I think the PLA's behavior so far now is remain very nascent. In international context, we see Beijing's outreach remain very limited. Then we mostly just bet on UN peacekeeping. So China has become the number 2 biggest donor in that kind of regard. But the problem is a lot of international skepticism is definitely coming down to the Chinese PLA's behavior, and then naming it as more aggressive and more provocative. But look at the South China Sea. The real aggressiveness of a PLA's behavior is back to 70s, 80s. Yes, we did fighting. Yes, we did coercion. But in the past 2 decades, no worship of PLA truly doing that way. So then I see some sort of such a labyrinth of the PLA as a growing provocative or assertive. I think is totally misleading.
Now, James, my understanding of Professor Zhu's analysis is that don't you think this is a crusade that aims to create the perception of China threat? Because as he said precisely, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of coercive things occurred. No warships, no aircraft appeared in the South China Sea to guarantee and protect the freedom of navigation and overflight. Overnight, this became a headline-making story. Why? Is that because of the deposits of energy, gas? Anybody from Australian side take this punch from the home team here?
My view is that if you look at the process, it seems on the face of it that China is being excessive in its expansion. It's absolutely true that other countries set up islands, and this was in a period when China was holding back. And then in 2010, 2011, China escalated in its relationship to the South China Seas. There was a lot of incidents. In fact, when
President Xi came in 2012. He tried to calm that down and said, we won't engage. What Australia sees, and I think the world sees, is a sense of excessiveness. We don't dispute the fact that China is developing these bases. We don't dispute the fact there's a historical claim. But what we look at is there's the disputed claim. Lots of countries in the region are claiming this area. And all Australia is saying, let's find out a rules-based system. We're not making a claim. We're not criticising. We're saying, what is the rules of which we can establish, of which we can have military engagement? I mean, Australia just flies planes over the China Sea for the last 30 years and no one cared about it. Now it becomes a big issue on the China side. We're flying planes. We've been doing that for 30 years. No one cared then. So it's going both sides. You can't have it both ways to say, now we're causing a problem when we were doing it before and no one cared. Yeah. So my view is, where is the rule-based system? Now, China says that the rules-based are based on Western colonialism. But in fact, if they want to change the rules, get engaged with the rules. And that's what we keep saying, is get engaged with the rules.
I wonder whether the Chinese leadership ever looks at the reaction, though, not necessarily isolating it within the context of the United States and Australia. In recent times, we've seen, for example, the United States end its very long-running arms embargo with Vietnam. That certainly would not have happened, I think, without what has happened with the militarisation of those islands in the South China Sea. The actions of the Chinese government and of its military are not winning friends in the region. It's not just the United States, it's not just Australia, because of its long-standing alliance agreements with the US that is behaving in this kind of way. You are alienating other countries within the region as well.
Well, let me get back to what this gentleman and Mr. Hofstad has said. Two key words. One is rule-based. So on whose rule? If we come to talk about rules, probably you're referring to UN Convention on Law of Sea, but let's talk about Article 58, which specified what freedom of navigation and overflight means. The US, and probably you, would quote the first paragraph to say all countries enjoy freedom of navigation and overflight. But look at the third paragraph of the same article, which underlines very clearly that in performing such kind of a freedom, you got to pay due regard to the rights of the littoral states. So China has, as early as in 1998, put freedom of navigation in its domestic law. So what kind of rules are you talking about? Secondly, about what you said, that China has no friends. And this reminds me what we have heard.
I didn't say no friends, but you're losing friends.
No, I don't think so, because back in Singapore during Shangri-La Dialogue, this is exactly what Ashton Carter has said. China is building a wall of isolation. But let's look at the fact. Over 100 million foreign visitors would come to China, and about 120 million Chinese would go overseas. So how come that China do not have friends? And China is the best trading partners to at least about 124 countries. So don't we have partners? You probably are only right if you argue that China has no allies, but that is a firm national policy of not having allies.
I mean, that's the point about a rules-based argument that Australia is making, is that we're trying to sit in the middle and not take sides, because it cuts both ways. We're quite clear that America's not a signatory. And we're quite clear there are issues.
But the Chinese have made it very clear that they will discuss on a bilateral basis. There's no reason for Chinese discussion with the Philippines to involve the Americans or the Australians, for that matter.
No, alienation is
why do you say multilateral?
Alienation is a good concept, but the problem is when alienation happens and other players just trying to, arm our neighbor with some sort of knife and a rifle and a missile tanks, that will deepen alienation and turn alienation, even some sort of a confrontation. So I think the things probably we should go that way. Firstly is the Beijing, of course, we needed to take the notes of your concern. But on the other hand, how you guys could react. If overreact, of course, will be leading to the overplay or over-abuse of the real situation.
Well, let me add something. Let's talk about something 5,000 miles away from these islands and shores into, for example, Indian Ocean, into Gulf of Aden. Because what you have asked essentially is the role of PLA in the future. Let's make it quite clear. PLA have all the ambitions to become modernized by the mid-century. That is a clearly defined goal. But in spite of the territorial dispute with some of the neighbors in the periphery, if you look at China, beyond all these coasts, all Chinese imperialist behavior is warmly welcome, be it counter-piracy, be it disaster relief, or all these kind of things actually we're doing in tandem with the Australian military in the Gulf of Aden. And a chaotic Middle East is asking for the hand of China. Why? Because Chinese hands are believed to be clean.
Can I say that we have been a great supporter of integrating China into rules-based organisations and international economic institutions. But I think what I see in this earlier conversation is the classic security dilemma where the Chinese side see that everything they're doing in the South China Sea as a defensive, justified and reasonable response to events around them. And I think the United States sees everything it's doing as justifiable response and essentially defensive within its larger worldview of what it's doing. And you have two sides, each convinced of their own defensive intention, taking us to a rather difficult point. And I think, and my view is, everyone should just step back a little bit at this point.
I make one point, moving on. It is in the DNA of Australia to have alliances. Since it was founded, it is in the DNA to have what it perceives as a reliable partner, and ideally two, if we looked at after the post-World War II period. And the fundamental strategy of Australia is probably not in defat, but never to put itself in a position where it has to choose between the United States or China, because if it goes one way, it breaks down that DNA of an alliance. The other way, it puts at risk its economic security. And then there is a dilemma. And basically, the other point I would make is it takes time to build an alliance and to evolve. If you look at the history of the Australian-US alliance, it took over 60 years. And it was a history of forging an alliance based on disputes. Ultimately,
I like your point, sir. So then I truly respect your history, respect your some sort of such a genetically molded, the alliance with the United States. 30 years is a long time. It's an unforgettable historical experience. But I think the key points from Chinese side is not to seek some sort of dissolution of the alliance with the U.S. We just ask for some sort of Australia's independence, China's strategic version to show your strategic way in the regional security. But of course, and exceptionally, I think most of Chinese just believe over almost all the points concerning the regional security dynamic. Australia is absolutely always lining up with the U.S. Then even some sort of a undercuts over economic and social relations with the Chinese.
I'd like to add another point to Professor Zhu said. You have to realize, you can talk about DNA that existed in the last century. Today is a different world. Globalization has changed everything, and the fundamentals of governmental or country-to-country relationship has also changed. I don't think you can talk about alliances in the context of what existed in the Second World War or the Cold War period anymore, because you're in me and I'm in you. Globalization has brought about that fundamental change. And changes in society, we talk about the aging of the Japanese population, but what about the ethnic composition of Australia, which is being changed significantly as well? Or the 1.2 million refugees that went to Germany last year. How many more are going from North Africa? These are things which are going to change the DNA of a country and change the DNA of country-to-country relationships. I don't think we should be in the Cold War mentality of alliances. And they're my ally, they're my backer, they will protect me. That will take you down to nowhere. really.
James?
Yes, question for the Chinese side. Gary talked about taking a step back, and he's not a spokesman for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but I suspect that if you got into their councils, you'd discover that that's pretty much what Australia would like China and the United States to do in relation to the South China Sea. What I'm wondering is this, given that China will not negotiate these disputed territories multilaterally, why is there not seen in Beijing some value in negotiating a joint management agreement to look at the resources and look after and exploit the resources of this important economic zone and set aside the discussions about the disputes for another times?
Very good question, but let me just follow your line and to talk about something else other than military. Exactly as you have mentioned, we can explore other areas of cooperation, and this is exactly what China and ASEAN countries are doing. In fact, China actually has tabled a 3 billion Chinese yuan maritime fund for all other countries to put forward any proposal that can be utilized. So COC, the purpose of the ASEAN countries, and outside is very clear, to bind the Chinese hand, if possible at all, while not talking about anything else. But for us, this is a comprehensive approach. And in the early period of COC negotiation, China and ASEAN have realized two most important early harvests. That is hotline between China and ASEAN countries when we have disaster relief. The other is to talk about emergency cases. I believe that actually underlies the situation in the South China Sea.
Your good ally, your strong partner, your friend, the Americans, are taking away your market.
We're now very much in track with how China is developing.
Do you still remember the last time when the United States pivoted
Does
out
financial cooperation present a significant driver?
Where is the support for these real engines of growth?
Okay, let's move on to another element of the relationship, trade and economics. Massive trade relationship, Australia and China, underpinned by a free trade agreement. But now that the global boom in commodities have subsided and the Chinese economy has slowed down, what does that mean for Australia as it too restructures its economy? Where are the opportunities? To introduce this topic, let's take a look at a video. Take a look now.
Over the past 40 years, Australia and China have become increasingly intertwined through trade, with China being Australia's largest trading partner and Australia China's fifth largest trading partner. This has led to the signing of the historic China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, or CHAFTA. Under the agreement, more than 96% of Australian exports to China will eventually be tariff-free. With tariff cuts, the first 3 months of 2016 have witnessed a big increase in China's import requests from Australia, especially for agricultural and fishery products. Between January and March 2016, Chinese imports of Australian wine grew more than 60% compared to the same period 12 months previously, to reach $160 million. China's imports of fresh Australian lobster were triple those of 12 months ago and exceeded China's entire 2015 imports of the delicacy. Imports of milk powder and fresh cherries more than doubled. China is also responsible for much of Australia's exports of iron ore and coal, and Chinese businesses have concluded a range of mining and minerals investments in the country. In 2015, total Chinese investment in Australia reached $11.1 billion, making Canberra Beijing's second largest destination for overseas investment. On the other hand, China's slowing demand for iron ore, coal, and other resources has taken a major toll on Australia's economy. Two-way trade totaled $115 billion in the last financial year, down 6.3%. The concern over the impact of China's economic new normal, however, is not shared by Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who said, "We embrace all of the extraordinary opportunities presented by China's own economic transition toward a more consumption-driven economy."
It's very interesting statistics and very interesting account of the recent past of Australia's trading relationship with China. But to the present day, there is a passionate debate going on in China at the moment at the highest levels about the sustainability of extremely high levels of debt and other forms of fiscal and monetary stimulus and the viability of that. It would seem to outside observers that this suggests that there is deep concern within the leadership in China that what will happen to China is something that's never occurred before, which is that there will be a hard landing. The rest of the world is right, is it not, to see that there are increasing prospects of this as reflected by this very serious debate that is going on at the moment.
Well, I think China's economy is undergoing some really fundamental and drastic changes, no question about that. And I mean, let's not forget that China started with a very low-income country with central planning economy, and 3 decades later, we're becoming the second largest economic power in the world. So I think, talking about what's going to happen to China, we cannot forget what has happened in China, how China has migrated such a long distance to become a very important player in the world financial system. And I think by looking at the video, I just want to say something, because I was interviewed yesterday about a U.S. complaint about China's overcapacity in steel production. And then I think Australia is concerned with China not producing enough steel. So I think we're facing such...
Australia is very worried about overproduction of steel in China and dumping of cheap steel on the world market too.
You're also worried about not being able to export as much iron ores to China at the same time. So I think that sort of reflects about the dilemma or the challenge that China's economic transition is facing. And then, yes, we are trying to get into a more market-oriented economy, a more consumption-driven economy. But let's not forget, China is such a big country with still a lot of people under the poverty line. So I think to make sure that we have the resources to move into the way that we wanted to, we have to maintain a reasonable growth speed. And to maintain that reasonable growth speed, I think there are certain things we have to do which do not fully comply with what the Western economics textbook teach us to. So I think that's a little bit special about China. And China is very unique in the sense that no such a large country has inherited China's problem and challenges. So in that regard, I think we would have to be pragmatic about what are the policy implications China could have taken to have impacted the rest of the world, and what would those policies in turn affect China's own economic and political future.
From a business perspective, Charles Liu, how concerned are you at managing or business managing affairs successfully at significantly lower growth rates than the world has been used to over the past couple of decades?
I would look at it this way. If you were a teenager and you grew 2 inches a year, seems normal. If you're 25 years old and you grew 2 inches a year, something's wrong. The base is very different. I've been investing in China since 1990. It's been a long time. And I see always changes of types of opportunity. The movement toward consumption, the movement toward services. We captured some of these possibilities 5-6 years ago, and they're booming. It's blossoming. Now, the investment in a steel manufacturer 10 years ago certainly didn't do very well. But I think in terms of the grant on the macro side, thinking about Australia, because I'm quite involved with businesses in Australia on liquefied natural gas, LNG. I think by 2018, Australia will be the biggest LNG exporter in the world. It's about to become that, the end of 2017. Bigger than Qatar, Kuwait, and even all the Saudis and the Gulf Council countries combined. Now, of course, $40 billion went into CAPEX, into developing that, and the price of that from 6 years ago at $15 to $18 per million BTU has gone down to about 5.5. So, there are issues. But I think in terms of China and Australia, I face some difficulties. Friends and I have tried to make investments in the dairy business and agricultural business. and one of which is quite prominent. It's a very major deal, which looks like will not be approved by the Australian government. And we are a private group. We have nothing to do with the Chinese SOEs or government. And we were, well, I think a couple of million Australian dollars was spent on the preparatory work and legal fees. Aussie lawyers are as expensive as American lawyers, unfortunately. So there are still issues with taking on Chinese investment. If we're not buying iron ore, I think there's plenty of land to raise cattle, to have milk, and to have all these things that the Chinese consumers want.
I would have to say that in the agricultural area, that's one of those exceptions where there's a review at a much smaller level, as you know very well, a lower level, because for many Australians, farmland is perceived as an emotional touchstone. I think it's the same in China as well. I don't think there's a lot of foreign investment in Chinese farmland. And so I think this is not uncommon. I myself am opposed to this. I think that we should have a more open policy, but realistically, politically, that's where we've come to. On the other part of what you were saying about resource exports, actually, Chinese demand has held up very strong. So quantities of what we're selling to China and what Chinese industry is wanting are, if anything, increasing. It's the price is falling. And because we've got some very competitive, low-cost producers, and they're doing what China has wanted for a long time, which is selling them the same amounts for smaller
a lot
price.
less money.
So that's suiting quite well.
What I was referring to, I think, sorry, to come back to just, is LNG. Okay, your good ally, your strong partner, your friend, the Americans, are taking away your market in this. Japan, major buyer of LNG, has long-term contracts in Australia. I'm involved in the business, so the first shipments of LNG from America is now headed for Japan. China will become a much more important buyer of your LNG, on which hundreds of billions in total have been invested. And Chinese are ready to sign long-term contracts. And that's happening as we speak.
And also, I want to just come back, just to say something about, I think the world is concerned with China's economy slowing down. But then I think there are two things we have to take into consideration. The first is, well, as Charles pointed out, I mean, it's impossible for China to maintain at an 8% annual growth rate. And for us to have a gradual slowdown is far better than growing the economy at 10% speed and then maybe reaching a bottleneck and then implode and create a disastrous financial crisis for the rest of the world. So I think between the two options, a gradual slowing down is probably a far better option than alternative. So I think that is one perspective I want to provide. The second is, well, let us not forget the GDP per capita in China is still only a fraction of that in the West. So talking about the low-cost productions that China is providing, it's not necessarily because Chinese are cutting corners, it's because fundamentally our labor costs are still far lower. And that is still one of the major competitive advantages of Chinese economy and export. And actually, it is the rest of the world that is taking advantage of Chinese cheap labor in the past 3 decades. Think about it, you can buy something that's at an even cheaper price in the US, in Walmart. So it's a little bit unfair to criticize China on its low labor costs or on its increasing labor costs at the same time when China is growing out of its cheap labor model into a more innovation and a more value-added growth model. So I think just like the military considerations, it probably takes another 5 years, maybe a few decades before we get it. And during this process, I guess both sides would have to be more patient than normal.
I agree perfectly with you. We need to find a paradigm and a partnership that is, and Australia ultimately needs to pivot or shift its economy on to be more in sectors beyond the just resources, which are very volatile in the marketplace. Could I be a hardliner on investment into Australia? Australia is number 2. It has, and it's all happened very quickly. And again, time is the issue. It is 80% of the US investment, number 1. The US is 11.6 times the size of the Australian economy. China has a penetration into the Australian economy much deeper than any other trading partner.
Since the financial meltdown back in 2008, Australia is exceptionally robust in its economic growth. Unlike most of the Western industrial nations, it largely depends on the Chinese imports of your iron ore, coal, so on and so forth. Now, what do you think of the issue of a resource curse? Because that occurred in most of the developing countries that have been dependent on their exports of commodities to big markets. Is that something that's going to happen to Australia?
No, I think, Yang Rui, that's a great question. And to the surprise of many Australians, we've started growing at 3.1%, is the most recent figure, just when our commodity prices have kept slumping. And I think one of the reasons is that we've reorientated our thinking about who are our markets, who we're relating to. We've caught up with, and we're now very much in track with how China is developing and other North Asian markets, as China's middle class is quite rightly expecting improved consumer goods and services and quality, and we're trying to meet those. And I think this is working pretty well. And I think the figures we saw as soon as the free trade agreement was signed, amazingly, quick off the blocks, like an athlete in a sprint, both sides have raced into this relationship in a deeper way. So I think this is looking good, actually, for our economy, moving from a dependence on resources to one on quality goods, value adding, services, exports.
I think the reason why Australia and China are such a perfect match for each other, or are such great trade partners, is because we need each other. I think we're about the same size, and Australian probably can use a little bit more people, and we can use a little bit more land. And then when it comes down to commodity prices, first of all, I'm very sympathetic to how sensitive Australia is to commodity prices. A couple of years ago, I was giving a speech in Sydney, and walking out of the auditorium, I was having an impression that Australians care more about the Chinese economy than Chinese do because of the sensitivity. But then I think you probably do not want to blame China for causing the changes. China is also the recipient of the commodity prices in the world market. So if anything, we are not on two sides of the same lever. We're actually on the same side. We're both susceptible to very big fluctuations in commodity prices. And if you look at the overcapacity problem in China, that's actually also being caused by the dropping prices in those commodities. So I think, if anything, I mean, going back to the currency, the commodity currency, if anything, we should probably work together to come up with a new financial order in which we're less impacted by the fluctuation or the movement in the global commodity prices. We should probably seal longer-term collaboration or agreement so that we are not susceptible to, I mean, yes, maybe there are changes in the world prices, but we are not being affected. We can sign a long-term bilateral agreement just to secure the supply and demand relationship.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for these rounds of debates and discussions. Well, a strong relationship between Australia and China is of vital interest for the future regional development, and it also matters globally. Today we have an audience with members from China and also the world over. You definitely have your comments and questions. First of all, a question from our distinguished guest here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Victor Gao. I'm a good friend of Australia. I've been to Australia 3 times, and I truly believe China and Australia have no reason not to be friends with each other. Now that we know that Australia and the United States have that treaty obligation, and if the United States finds itself in a war with China, Australia will need to fight with the United States against China. That will be a disaster for both China and the United States. Well, given that treaty obligation, my question is, does this give Australia more reason to cheer for the outbreak of a war, possibly, and God forbid, between China and the United States? Or does it give more reason for Australia to exercise all its sanity, to exercise its great wisdom, to calm down the United States, to prevent the outbreak of a war? Because if it does break out, it will be a disaster for Australia as well as for China. Thank you very much.
Who'd like to pick up that hot potato?
Look, Australia would like to, first of all, the idea of some major conflict between China and the United States would be a disaster for everybody, starting with China and the United States, and then everybody else as well. So that's something we obviously would be wanting to do whatever we could to ensure would not happen.
Okay.
Australia has always sought to have an independent position as far as it can against the United States, and Australia has always opposed those forces in the United States that talk openly about the containment of China as a strategy, and this is completely rejected by our government. So I think Australia would see itself as having an important role in moderation and in the private council with the United States, with those who are listening, have that council. As a conflict tension rises, great powers listen less to other parties. They stop listening. China stops listening, United States stops listening, and they look at each other across the table. So when the paradox is Australia has more influence when there's less tension. So if we can step back a little bit from the current moment, that's the point at which Australia is likely to have more influence with the United States.
Another question we have from the audience. Hand up, gentleman in the middle. Just wait for the microphone and identify yourself as you speak up.
My name is Jorge Jaime. I'm the ambassador of Chile. Chile signed a free trade agreement with China in 2005, and it's been very good for both parties. But right now, given the commodity slump, it is facing some challenges. So I have a question for our Australian friends. To what degree does financial cooperation, I understand that quite a few Chinese banks in Australia, quite a few Australian banks in China, to what extent does financial cooperation present a significant driver to move on with the relationship at a time when trade in goods is facing some challenges? Thank you.
I think they're very good questions, because we keep talking nation to nation, state to state, leader to leader, but most of the relationships that occur between countries are people to people, corporations to corporations. They build up links and networks, and Australia has done tremendously well in the last 40 years in doing that. The links are very strong, in the same way as our links with Chile are strong. So my view is that if you look at the sub-national level, the links between Australia and China have grown enormously and never been as strong. As I said before, you've got a million Chinese descendants living in Australia. You've got 130,000 students coming every day. You've got corporations that link across the continent all the time. So I think the relationships are very strong, and that they grow because of those financial links. And we've got to look beneath what leaders say and what governments say to see where the strength of any relationship is.
Thank you very much. Can I take a question from the cowboy in the middle?
Cowboy in the middle.
Thank you. My name's Sam Burton-Taylor, and we're cattle farmers from Australia. 3 years ago, we came to China for the first time, and we've seen in our time, in the 5 or 6 years since cattle trade has expanded and grown 65% from 2010 to 2016. And a big part for our growth is looking to be technology. All of our business is done on WeChat. When I go to the supermarket, I see customers scanning the QR code on kiwi fruit and beef. And my question to the panel is, what evolutions in technology do you think we're going to see in the next 10 years that is going to give small and medium-sized businesses in Australia direct access to the Chinese consumers?
One of the things to think about China, and I have only been here 5 months, but the thing that strikes me on both sides is, in some senses, the state sector is over-regulated, and that the market sector is probably under-regulated, and that's led to, as you say, WeChat, which is the world leader in innovation, But when it goes into the area of finance, it has problems. So I think that's where Australia could help. Innovation in China is enormous. I think we've got a lot to learn. But Australia's been very good at innovation too. I think a lot of our financial packages that banks offer are really brilliant. Most firms are really into innovation, and our farmers have been tremendously innovative. So my view is that there's strong connections to innovation between the two. Both leaders use the same language. Xi Jinping talks about innovation, and Malcolm Turnbull does. So I think there's great hope for the two countries, and we share things in common in dealing with that. So I've been really impressed with the way the complementation can happen. It's not just words, it will happen. Yeah.
And time for just one final question from Colin McCarris, please.
I'd like to ask the panel how they react and how seriously we should take the recent attempt by the trade unions in Australia to oppose the China Free Trade Agreement, China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, even to the extent of having advertising campaigns, demonstrations and things like that in an election campaign, which seems to me, I don't remember that being, China being an issue in an election campaign for quite a while now. And now that it's being brought up actually by the trade unions, who have been, Labor has been in the forefront of promoting Australia-China relations, now they seem to be in the forefront of opposing them. At least the trade unions do. And I wonder how seriously we should take this and how the panel reacts to this point that I just made.
Well, it's some trade unions. It's not all trade unions. Two particular trade unions have begun this campaign. So I wouldn't read much into it at all at the moment, but it is trying to deal with a particular issue to do with the wages paid to workers coming under certain visa conditions and a belief that people are being underpaid. That's what they're playing into, concerns about undercutting jobs. But those concerns need to be allayed by clear government policy statements and positions to ensure that the visa regime operates properly.
Yeah, I think also there are some sectors where this restructuring will create change. And if you look into the forestry and products industry, the auto industry and that, there has been a tendency over the last decade, 15 years, where Australian public policy has been driven by, and again, this is a personal view, that driven by incumbent investors at the expense of new investors coming into the country. And that's unfortunate. And unfortunately, there's sometimes alliances between business and incumbent investors and the trade unions to maintain the status quo rather than allow a restructuring of an economy and the movement of manufacturing, particularly to the opportunities that can be seen up in Asia.
A question from the second row in the front. I think, Anna.
Well, since the elephant in the room is the United States, I'm a U.S. citizen. So, but rather than try to comment, I think you've done a wonderful job of identifying all the problems. Let's talk about solutions. Would China be willing to put aside, not put aside territorial claims, but simply say to the rest of the world and all of the South China Sea, we will create an economic zone, maybe around that 9-dash line that everyone talks about. That will be for the benefit of everybody within that area, and there will be a formula to justify it. China could certainly use the energy and the resources that are locked up there, as could the other nations there. It could be a vital part of a Belt and Road Initiative, and it would certainly solve that.
Will an economic zone be created along the 9-dash line for joint exploration? I mean, this is a very sexy issue.
Yeah, I think it's a very marvelous idea, so why not? So then, just as I say, first of all, we need to keep the end open. So yes, now the China feel increasingly more insecure because U.S. along with the other powers just moving very close on just has enforced China backing off. But we consider our sovereign claim of the South China Sea is truly combination of the history and modern international instruments. That's the problem is we also see some sort of selective approach now is prevailing in the region. So when we talk about Canberra, talk about Australia and France, they also very sincerely recognize some sort of historical feasibility of a Chinese claim. They very bluntly say, no, that's all past. But for Chinese, history does not pass. History is still alive. So then we also see the China's big legality of the sovereign claims in South China Sea. We couldn't just make it suffer from some sort of bigger pounding from the group of the powers in the region. But we need an exit. We need some sort of option, not just to de-escalate the tension, but also find a way, ease down for some sort of permanent solution. So I think non-industrial friend, the EEZ, is at least one of the alternatives. But the problem is we also could think of the other alternative. For example, we should build coastal states, some sort of a maritime cooperation mechanism. We also just take the step to substantiate joint development rather than just focusing on the sovereign disputes. But whatever it is, we need to working together. We need also to keep the end open for all the states.
Well, thank you very much. I believe all of you have tons of questions about this wonderful debate between Australian team and the home team here. But Jim, this is the first time for us to cooperate on this very special podium. But what do you think of your own performance?
Oh, look, as all Australians always do, I think we punched above our weight.
Thank you very much. Now, this program will be broadcast 4 times on CCTV News, and if you like, you can see it on our website or other CCTV social media. By the way, Jim, I do look forward to having the next round in your country, similar debates between the two teams. Are you ready?
Indeed, a return bout, no less. It is also being broadcast on SKYNEWS Australia, but this is not the end of it. There will be a second debate. It will take place in the studios of SKYNEWS Australia. Ray, thank you very much, and to your panel too.
Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel. Terrific.
Good job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Professor,
much.
thank you. Charles, thank you very much. Thanks for staying around. Thanks.